In 1842 Georgia, a crime existed that carried greater peril than the act of running away. It was not a slap on the wrist offense. It was a whipping crime, a sail away from family crime. And yet, every night, by the weakest candle flame, she could coax from pine splinter and bacon grease, a young enslaved girl broke the law, one stolen letter at a time. In the pine-heavy backcountry of Georgia, in a year when the price of cotton determined the fates of millions and the lives of human beings were entered as numbers in plantation ledgers, this girl committed an act of resistance more dangerous than theft, more subversive than violence, more threatening to the entire architecture of Southern slavery than any act of rebellion the overseers feared. She did not steal food from the smokehouse, though hunger gnawed at her constantly. She did not strike her overseer, though rage simmered beneath her careful silence day after relentless day. She did not poison a meal, or set fire to a cotton shed, or attempt any of the dramatic acts of defiance that filled plantation owners with dread. She did something quieter, something that could not be confiscated or whipped out of her once it took root. Before we go further, take a moment to imagine risking everything just to learn your own name. If stories like this matter to you, stay with me. She learned to read, not loudly, not proudly, not in any classroom or under any teacher's careful guidance, but alone, by candlelight, in the suffocating darkness of the slave quarters, knowing that every single word she deciphered could cost her life, her family, and whatever fragile peace she had been permitted to exist within. This is the story of what her life might have been, reconstructed from fragments, from laws that sought to prevent her existence, from the scattered testimonies of those who survived to tell their own tales of forbidden literacy. She left no diary, no memoir, no letter to mark her passage through this world. But the system that tried to keep her ignorant left extensive records. And from those records, from anti-literacy laws and court cases, from plantation documents and abolitionist accounts, the shape of her life can be pieced together. A child whose crime was curiosity, a girl whose weapon was a book, a mind that refused to accept the boundaries of bondage. She was born sometime around 1829 on a cotton plantation near Milledgeville, Georgia, in the years when cotton was king and human beings were the currency that sustained its reign. No record listed her name at birth. No Bible recorded her arrival in the margins, alongside the names of free children. No county clerk noted her existence in any ledger that would survive to speak of her. Enslaved children rarely had names that lasted. They were called whatever was convenient, girl, gal, that, child, until they grew old enough or valuable enough to warrant something more permanent. Even then, the names they received were often not their own choosing. They were assigned, like everything else about their lives. Perhaps her mother named her something beautiful in a whispered moment, something that meant hope or strength or memory. Perhaps that name lived only between them, spoken in the quarters when the white family slept, carried in the lullabies her mother might have sung when work permitted rest. But for the purposes of the plantation ledger, she was simply Negro girl, born 1829, property of the name of her owner mattered. Hers did not. She was inventory before she was human, a future asset before she was a child. Her value was calculated in the labor she would one day perform in the children she might one day bear, who would themselves become property. This was the mathematics of slavery. Human beings reduced to numbers in a ledger, their worth measured in dollars and cents, their futures determined by the market price of cotton and the whims of men who owned them. By the time she was 13, old enough to understand the architecture of her captivity, but young enough to still feel the sharp edge of its injustice, she had absorbed the rules of her world with a clarity only a child forced into premature adulthood can possess. The rules were unwritten, but absolute, enforced through generations of violence and threat. Speak only when spoken to. Keep your eyes downcast in the presence of white people. Never ask questions, especially not why. Never look too long at letters on paper, at books left open on tables, at newspapers discarded in waste bins. Never show intelligence, because intelligence in a slave was either wasted or dangerous. Never suggest you understood more than you were supposed to. And above all, never ever learn to read. Because in Georgia, by 1842, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal. The law was explicit, the penalties severe, the enforcement inconsistent, but terrifying when it came. The relevant statute, passed in 1829, the very year of her birth, declared that any person who taught a slave to read or write, or who gave or sold any book to a slave, could be fined and imprisoned. For white people who violated this law, the fine could reach $500, more than a year's wages for many. For free black people who taught slaves, the penalty could include whipping and indefinite imprisonment. For enslaved people caught learning, the punishment was left to their owners' discretion, which meant it could range from a warning to a brutal whipping to sail to the deep south where conditions were even more brutal, or worse, being made an example, a body displayed to teach others the cost of aspiration. This was not unique to Georgia. Across the South, similar laws proliferated in the 1830s and 1840s, each one a response to the same fear, that literacy was the gateway to liberation, that enslaved people who could read might encounter abolitionist literature, might forge passes to freedom, might organize resistance, might begin to see themselves as fully human and therefore entitled to freedom. Frederick Douglass would later write, "To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate his power of reason." The law understood this. The plantation owners understood this. Even the overseers, barely literate themselves, understood this. And she understood it too. But understanding the danger did not diminish the longing. Silence had a way of sharpening curiosity, of turning forbidden knowledge into an obsession. When every door is closed, the mind begins to pick locks. She noticed letters everywhere, etched into the wooden crates that held supplies. From Savannah, printed on the shipping papers that accompanied bolts of cloth, stitched into the leather-bound Bibles that sat on the parlor table she dusted. Every morning, they surrounded her like a locked language, a code that separated those who commanded from those who obeyed. The plantation owner read newspapers at breakfast, his eyes scanning the columns, while she stood silent in the corner, waiting to refill his coffee. His wife read novels in the afternoon, reclining on the settee while the girl fanned her mistress against the Georgia heat. Their daughter labored through school books with a tutor who came twice weekly from town, reciting conjugations and mathematical tables in a bored, sing-song voice that floated through the house like an insult. Even the overseer, a crude man who could barely sign his own name, kept a ledger where he recorded discipline and work output in rough, blocky letters. History doesn't always record voices like hers. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, you're already part of keeping them alive. Words had power in this world. They conveyed ownership. They created laws. They defined who was human and who was property. And the girl wanted the key to that power. Not for rebellion, not yet. Not in any fully conscious way. Simply because her mind refused to accept that some knowledge was meant only for others. That her intelligence, sharp, observant, relentless, had no legitimate outlet, no permission to exist. So it turned inward, observing, cataloging, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. At 13, her body was changing in ways that brought new dangers. She was no longer the child who could move invisibly through the main house, too small and young to be noticed as anything other than a pair of working hands. She was becoming a young woman, And that transformation brought the attention of men. White men with power, enslaved men with none, all of them navigating a world where her consent was not legally possible, where her body was property to be used as others saw fit. Her mother, worn thin by decades of field work and childbearing, tried to warn her, in the only way she could, by teaching her to be smaller, quieter, less visible. "Don't give him no reason to notice you," she whispered one evening as they sat together outside the quarters, shelling peas by the last light of day. "Keep your head down. Do your work. Don't be smart where they can see it." It was good advice for survival. It was terrible advice for a mind that had already begun to hunger for something more. The other enslaved children her age were already being trained in specialized tasks. The boys were learning carpentry or blacksmithing if they showed aptitude, being sent to the fields if they did not. The girls were learning to sew, to cook, to care for white children, to perform the domestic labor that kept the plantation functioning. She performed her assigned tasks adequately, well enough not to be punished, not so well as to invite heavier burdens. She learned to move through the world with strategic mediocrity, to hide her sharpness beneath a performance of simplicity. But at night, in the privacy of her own mind, she was already planning, already watching, already waiting for a chance that would either save her or destroy her. The opportunity came by accident, as most dangerous opportunities do. It was late summer, 1842. The heat lay over Georgia like a wet blanket, making everyone irritable and careless. The cotton bolls were beginning to open in the fields, which meant the hardest work was still ahead. Weeks of picking from dawn to dusk, fingers bleeding, backs aching, quotas that had to be met or punishment would follow. But that afternoon, she was working in the main house, which offered at least the illusion of shade and the possibility of water whenever she needed it. The plantation owner's daughter, a girl named Catherine, perhaps 14 years old, possessed of all the privileges her father's wealth could purchase, had grown tired of her schoolbooks. The tutor had assigned her a reader, a tedious collection of moral tales and pronunciation exercises designed to improve young ladies' elocution and character. Catherine found it unbearably dull. The stories were insipid, tales of obedient children and grateful servants, of virtue rewarded and vice punished. She wanted to read novels, romantic stories of adventure and passion. But her father insisted she master the fundamentals first, in a fit of boredom or spite, or perhaps simply because she could. Because destruction was a privilege afforded to those who owned rather than those who were owned. She tossed the torn reader into the trash heap behind the main house. The enslaved girl was working nearby, carrying water from the well to the kitchen, when she saw the book arc through the air and land among the potato peels and broken crockery. Most people would have seen garbage. She saw treasure, but she could not retrieve it immediately, not in daylight, not where anyone might see and question why a slave girl was interested in a discarded book. So she memorized the location next to the broken barrel beneath the magnolia tree and waited. Patience had become her most refined skill. That night, she waited until the quarters went quiet, until the last conversations died down, the tired voices of men and women who had worked since before sunrise, discussing the day's events in low tones, sharing what little news traveled between plantations, speculating about who might be sold, who might be punished, who might attempt to run, until breathing turned heavy and rhythmic, the deep, exhausted sleep of bodies pushed beyond their limits, until the night insects filled the air with their constant chorus, crickets and frogs, and the distant hoot of an owl, sounds that would mask her footsteps, until even the overseer's dog stopped its restless pacing and settled into sleep with a final grumbling sigh. Then she moved. The quarters were arranged in 2 rows facing each other across a dirt yard, crude wooden structures with gaps in the walls wide enough to let in cold in winter and Heat in summer. Privacy was impossible. Someone was always awake, always listening, always potentially watching. Children stirred in their sleep. Adults snored or coughed or whispered to each other in the darkness. But she had learned to move quietly, to place her feet with care on the wooden steps that creaked if you stepped in the center, but stayed silent if you kept to the edges. She had learned to time her movements with the sounds of the night, to walk when the wind rustled the trees or when the dog barked at some distant sound. The trash heap was only 50 yards from a quarters, but it might as well have been a mile. Every step was a risk. Being caught outside after curfew meant punishment, 10 lashes, maybe more, depending on the overseer's mood. Being caught with a book meant something far worse. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, but also enough light to be seen. She stayed close to the buildings, moving through shadows, pausing when clouds briefly covered the moon. The book was still there. She found it by moonlight, half buried beneath wet leaves and kitchen scraps, its pages damp with dew. It was missing pages, stained with what looked like spilled tea or wine, half burned at one corner where someone had perhaps used it to start a fire and then thought better of it. The cover embossed with faded gold lettering read, "The American Reader," containing selections in prose and poetry for the use of schools. She could not read those words yet, but she traced them with her fingers, feeling the raised letters, the texture of the leather binding beneath the dirt and damage. Then she hid it beneath her ragged shirt, pressing it against her stomach, and walked back to the quarters with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. No one stirred. No one saw. She had crossed the first threshold. That night, crouched in the corner of her sleeping space with the book hidden beneath her thin blanket, she opened it for the first time with trembling hands. The pages were filled with strange symbols arranged in neat rows. Black marks on yellowing paper, organized into blocks separated by white space. Some blocks were longer than others. Some had larger marks at the beginning. She recognized a few symbols from signs and labels she had seen around the plantation. The letter A appeared on the barrel of apples in the root cellar. The letter M was carved into the mile marker post on the road to town. The letter S was branded into the side of sugar barrels. But recognition was not the same as understanding. She did not know what the symbols meant, did not know that they represented sounds, did not know that sounds could be combined into words, that words could be combined into sentences, that sentences could convey meaning across time and space. She did not know yet that she was looking at a key that could unlock every door that had ever been closed to her. But she memorized them anyway, one letter at a time, the curve of an S, like a snake frozen mid-slither, graceful and dangerous. The straight vertical line of an I, simple and elegant, standing alone. The mysterious perfect circle of an O, complete unto itself, without beginning or end. The sharp angles of an A triangle with a crossbar, stable and strong. The soft curves of a B, like two pregnant bellies stacked one atop the other. She traced them with her finger in the dirt floor beside her pallet, scratching the shapes into the earth and then smoothing them away before anyone woke. She saw them when she closed her eyes, white against the darkness of her eyelids, floating and rearranging themselves like stars. They became shapes with weight, with texture, with a meaning she could not yet grasp, but could feel hovering just beyond her understanding. For weeks, the letters remained mysterious. She studied them in stolen moments, a few minutes before dawn when she woke before the overseer's bell, a brief interval while the white family ate dinner and she was not needed to serve. The dangerous hours after the quarters fell silent when her exhaustion fought against her determination to learn. She began to notice patterns. Certain letters appeared together frequently. TH at the beginning of many words, ING at the end of others, AND standing alone between other words. Then one day, while dusting the parlor, she heard Catherine reading aloud to her younger brother, practicing her elocution as her tutor had instructed. The cat sat on the mat, the girl recited. her finger moving beneath the words on the page, her voice careful and deliberate as she enunciated each syllable. And something clicked in the enslaved girl's mind. A connection formed between what her ears heard and what her eyes had seen on the pages of her hidden book. The sounds Catherine was making corresponded to the marks on the page. CAT made the sound cat. SAT made the sound Saturday. The letters were not just decorative. They were a code for speech, a way of capturing words and holding them still so they could be transported across distance and time. This revelation was staggering in its implications. It meant that every book held voices, that written words were frozen speech, waiting to be thawed by her readers. That someone could write something down in one place and time, and another person could read it in a completely different place and time, and the meaning would transfer across that gap. It meant that the power of reading was not just about knowing what the marks meant. It was about hearing the voices of people she had never met, learning thoughts that existed outside her immediate world, accessing knowledge that had been deliberately kept from her. She returned to her hidden reader with new urgency that night. Now when she looked at the pages, she tried to match the letters to sounds she knew. She found 3-letter words and sounded them out silently. CAT, cat. DOG, dog. RAT, rat. Slowly, painfully slowly, she began to teach herself what the plantation owner's daughter had learned with a tutor, what white children learned in schools, what was supposedly beyond the capacity of her race to understand. She learned to read, not quickly, not easily, but she learned. And with each word deciphered, each sentence understood, she felt something changing inside her. A door opening, a light turning on, a freedom that existed in her mind even as her body remained in chains. Candles were rare in the slave quarters, precious as gold, doled out sparingly if at all. The plantation owner purchased them by the box for the main house, where they illuminated evening entertainments and late-night reading, where they created pools of warm light in parlors and bedrooms, where they were used casually and replaced frequently. Matches were even rarer, kept locked in a cabinet in the main house to prevent fires, and perhaps to prevent the very kind of late-night study she was attempting. So she improvised with the resourcefulness that defined survival in bondage. Pine splinters dipped in bacon grease became makeshift torches. The wood had to be dry, split thin enough to burn slowly, but thick enough to hold together. The grease thick enough to catch flame, but not so thick it dripped and wasted. These crude lights produced small, smoky flames that lasted perhaps 5 or 10 minutes at most, filling the air with the smell of burning fat and pine resin, a smell she learned to minimize by holding the flame close to her face, cupping it with her hand. She collected the splinters during the day, picking them up from the wood pile where the men split logs for the main house's fireplaces, hiding them in her pockets, beneath her pallet, anywhere they would not be noticed or questioned. The grease was harder to acquire. She saved the scrapings from pans she washed in the kitchen, the drippings from meat she prepared, tiny amounts accumulated over days and weeks until she had enough to coat her makeshift wicks. Every drop was precious, stolen in quantities too small to be missed but sufficient over time to fuel her education. She hid the book beneath a loose floorboard near her pallet, a space she had discovered years earlier while lying awake during a storm, listening to the rain drum against the roof and feeling the slight draft that came up through a gap in the planks. One night, unable to sleep, she had pressed on the board and felt it give slightly. With careful work over several nights, she had loosened it enough to lift, revealing a space beneath, perhaps 8 inches deep, just enough for a slim volume and a few other treasures she had accumulated over the years, a button she had found in the road, carved from horn, beautiful and useless to her, that a scrap of ribbon, blue silk, discarded by Catherine. A smooth stone from a creek, perfectly oval, cool to the touch. These were her possessions, things that had no monetary value, but belonged to her in a way nothing else did. The book fit perfectly in that space, as though the hiding place had been waiting for it all along, that N01 suspected. No one looked. Enslaved people were supposed to own nothing, want nothing, hide nothing. Their possessions, the few rags they wore, the rough blankets they slept under, the tin cups they ate from, were barely theirs, subject to confiscation or redistribution at any moment. Their living spaces could be searched at any time, their belongings examined, their bodies inspected. But this space was hers because no one imagined she had anything worth hiding. Every night, in the dangerous space between exhaustion and discovery, she lifted that board and retrieved her teacher. Her education followed no curriculum, no logical sequence. She learned whatever the reader contained, in whatever order her ability allowed her to access it. Letters. First, she memorized all 26 letters of the alphabet, both the large capitals that began sentences and proper names, and the small letters that made up most words. She learned that letters had names, A, B, C, but also sounds that could change, depending on context. The letter C could sound like K in cat or S in city. The letter G could be hard in go or soft in gentle. Then words she was not supposed to know. Freedom. She found this word in a passage about American independence, about colonists freeing themselves from British tyranny, about taxation without representation, and the natural rights of man. The irony was not lost on her that a reader designed to instill American values in white children casually discussed freedom as a natural right, while she, reading it in secret, possessed no such right, while her children and her children's children were destined for the same bondage. River. Rivers meant geography, meant routes, meant the possibility of travel. The plantation sat near the Oconee River, which she could sometimes hear from a quarters. When the night was quiet, beyond it, to the north, were other rivers, the Chattahoochee, the Tennessee, the Ohio. Rivers could carry a person away, could mark the path to freedom if you knew which direction to follow. North. The direction appeared in multiple contexts, geographic descriptions, political discussions, agricultural comparisons between northern and southern climates. But she learned from whispered conversations in the quarters that it also meant something else. The place where slavery did not exist, where black people could live as free men and women, where the laws were different and a person could not be owned. God. This word appeared frequently in the moral tales, always capitalized, always presented as the ultimate authority, the force that justified all earthly hierarchies, the divine presence that ordained some to rule and others to serve. But she had also heard other interpretations whispered by an old preacher who occasionally held secret services in the woods, a God of liberation, of exodus, of justice, who stood with the oppressed against their oppressors. The same words meant different things depending on who read them and what they brought to the reading. She mouthed the words silently, her lips forming shapes without sound, her tongue pressing against her teeth to make consonants that never emerged as noise. Reading out loud was too dangerous. The walls of the quarters were thin, rough planks with gaps, wide enough to see through in daylight, wide enough to hear through at night. A voice would carry across the space between pallets, would wake someone, would prompt a question she could not answer safely. So she learned to read the way a deaf person might, with her eyes and her silent mouth, the words existing only in the space between perception and thought, never emerging into the audible world. This silent reading became second nature, became the only way she knew. Words became companions in a world designed to isolate her even while surrounding her with people. She was never physically alone in the quarters, 50 or more enslaved. People crowded into inadequate space, sleeping side by side, with barely a foot between pallets. But loneliness existed even in crowds, especially when you carried secrets. When you were becoming something different from those around you, when you possessed knowledge that separated you from your community. Every word she learned was a small act of resistance, a quiet rebellion against a system that required her to remain ignorant, to remain enslaved. Every sentence she deciphered was proof that the system lied about who she was and what she could become. She learned that master was spelled M-A-S-T-E-R, that it was just a collection of letters arranged in a particular order, not a law of nature or a commandment from heaven. That it was a title men claimed, not a truth ordained by God. She learned that property was spelled P-R-O-P-R-T-Y, that it was a word someone had written down in a law, which meant someone else could write something different, could erase that law and replace it with another. She learned that free and freedom shared the same root, that they were connected to words like liberty and independence that Americans celebrated every 4th of July with fireworks and speeches while holding millions in bondage, seeing no contradiction in their actions. The very act of reading dismantled the myth of her own inferiority brick by brick. Because if she could learn this, could teach herself, with no teacher, with only a damaged book and stolen light, with constant fear and interrupted study, then what else might she be capable of? What other lies had she been told about herself, about her race, about her capacity? Reading opened a door she had not known existed. And through that door she glimpsed a version of herself that was full and human and capable. Everything the law said she was not, everything the plantation system required her not to be. Someone noticed. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, over weeks and months, a pattern emerged that caught the attention of someone who knew what to look for, someone who had once possessed the same dangerous knowledge. An older enslaved man, a carpenter named Samuel who had been on the plantation since before she was born, who had seen 3 different owners and survived them all. Through a combination of skill and strategic submission, recognized the way her eyes moved. He had seen it before, in another life that seemed like a dream now. Samuel had once been hired out to a printer in Milledgeville, back in the 1820s. Before the laws tightened, before the Nat Turner Rebellion made white Southerners paranoid about educated slaves, before every scrap of black literacy became a threat to be eliminated. For 3 years, he had worked in that print shop, setting type, reading backwards in the composing stick, absorbing literacy almost by accident as he assembled words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, paragraphs into pages. The printer had been a Quaker, opposed to slavery, but not willing to risk everything to fight it, content to employ hired-out slaves and pay their owners while teaching them, inadvertently through exposure to letters. Then Samuel's owner had decided the risk outweighed the profit, had heard rumors of literate slaves forging passes, had grown nervous about what Samuel might be learning, and brought him back to the plantation, where Samuel had carefully hidden his abilities. For nearly 2 decades, knowing that literacy made him valuable, but also made him dangerous, that the wrong person discovering his secret could mean his death. He recognized the signs in her, the way her gaze lingered on discarded newspapers even when she should have been working, the way she held a scrap of paper when she thought no one was watching, the slight movement of her lips as though sounding out words, the careful attention she paid when white people read aloud. He waited until they were alone, working side by side in the barn where he was repairing a broken wagon wheel, and she was supposed to be sweeping out the stalls, though she moved slowly, distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. "You learning to read?" he asked quietly, not looking at her, his hands continuing their work on the wheel, his voice barely louder than the sound of his plane shaving wood. She froze. Her heart stopped. The world narrowed to this moment, this question. This danger crystallized into 5 simple words. Deny it, that was the only safe response. Lie convincingly, and hope he believed her. But something in his tone made her pause. He was not asking to trap her. He was not threatening. He was asking because he knew, because he recognized something in her that he had once seen in himself. "I can tell," he said, still not looking at her, still working the wheel, as though this were a casual conversation about nothing important. "The way you look at words, the way your eyes move across a page when you think nobody's watching. I used to do the same thing before I learned to hide it better. He glanced at her then, his face serious. Aged beyond his years by hard work and careful survival. If they catch you, they won't punish the book. They'll punish you. You understand that. She knew this already. Had known it from the very beginning. From the first moment she had stolen that reader from the trash heap. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had survived by hiding the same knowledge, made it real in a different way. The danger was not abstract. It was not hypothetical. It was specific, immediate, and survivable only through careful strategy and constant vigilance. Not careful enough if I noticed, he said. You need to be better than careful. You need to be invisible. But Samuel did not just warn her. Over the following weeks, in stolen moments when they could work near each other without arousing suspicion, he taught her how to sound out a full sentence by breaking it into smaller pieces, not just individual words, but phrases, clauses, the grammatical structure that made meaning possible. How to remember what she read, because the book might not survive, because evidence had to be destroyed, because memory was the only library an enslaved person could safely keep, the only archive that could not be searched or confiscated. Read it once slowly, he told her while they worked together, moving supplies into storage. Pay attention to everything. The words, the way they fit together, the meaning they make. Then read it again, but this time see it in your mind like a picture. Make the words visual. Give them shape and color. Then close the book and say it back to yourself, silent in your mind. Keep doing that until you can recite it without looking, until the words are carved into your memory. Then burn the page if you have to. The page can betray you. Your memory can't. He taught her about context, how to guess at words she did not know by understanding the words around them, how language created its own clues if you paid attention. He taught her about patterns in language, about how words were built from smaller parts that repeated across different words. Unlike, unkind, unable. Reread, rewrite, remember. Hopeless, careless, fearless. Freedom, kingdom, wisdom. Understanding these patterns accelerated her learning exponentially, allowed her to decode new words by recognizing familiar components. That he even taught her a few words she would not find in her simple reader. Words that existed in the wider world of political discourse and social commentary. Abolition, emancipation, insurrection, rebellion, liberty, equality. These are the words they don't want you to know, he said one afternoon while they were supposed to be sorting nails in the workshop, their voices covered by the sound of hammering from outside. The words that exist in newspapers and pamphlets and speeches. The words that white people whisper about when they think we can't hear, when they're afraid we might understand what they mean. Knowledge. Once you can read, Samuel told her one afternoon while they were repairing fence posts at the far edge of the property, out of earshot of the overseer. They can take everything from you but that. They can sell you south to Mississippi or Alabama where the work is harder and the life is shorter. They can work you to death in the cotton fields. They can beat you until you can't stand, until your back is nothing but scars. But that, he tapped his head with a gnarled finger, that lives in here. And your head is the one place they can't chain. The one place that stays yours no matter what they do to your body. This became her philosophy, her sustaining belief through the difficult months and years that followed. Literacy as internal property, as the one thing that could not be confiscated or sold or transferred to another owner. Literacy as a kind of freedom that existed independent of physical circumstances, that persisted even in the midst of bondage. Frederick Douglass would later write something similar, though she would never read. His words, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. He did not mean physically free. He was still enslaved for years after learning to read, still subject to beatings and sale and all the horrors of bondage. He meant free in mind, free in imagination, free in the ability to conceive of a different world, free from the mental slavery that made physical slavery possible. She was learning the same lesson, in a different place at a different time, but with the same result. The chains on her body felt heavier once her mind was free, but at least she knew they were chains, and not the natural order of existence, knew they had been forged by men, and could be broken by men, knew that her enslavement was a crime rather than her destiny. But this knowledge came with a cost. Ignorance had offered a kind of protection, the ability to accept her circumstances without constantly measuring them against alternatives, without the corrosive awareness of injustice eating away at her peace. Now she could not unknow what she had learned, could not unsee the contradictions, could not pretend that her condition was natural or inevitable or ordained by God. She read in the American Reader about liberty and justice and equality, about the rights of man and the social contract, about government deriving its power from the consent of the governed. And then she went back to work cooking meals she would not eat, washing clothes she could not wear, caring for children who would grow up to own people like her. The dissonance was maddening. Samuel noticed her growing anger. Careful, he warned her. Anger makes you visible, makes you careless. You can't let them see what you're thinking. How do you bear it? She asked him one day. Knowing what you know, seeing what you see. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I remember that I'm still here, that I've survived when others haven't, that every day I wake up is a victory they can't take from me. And I wait, because everything changes eventually. Slavery won't last forever. It can't. Too many people are fighting against it, even if we can't see that fight from where we stand. She wanted to believe him. But belief was hard when the evidence of her eyes showed nothing but endless cotton fields, and the overseer's whip, and the auction block ware. Families were torn apart. Still, she held on to it. That subtle hope, that quiet faith that the world might yet be different than it was. By 1844, 2 years into her secret education, she could read full passages with genuine comprehension. Not quickly. She still had to sound out difficult words, still struggled with complex sentence structures. Not with the ease of someone who had been reading since childhood, who had had teachers and time and encouragement, but competently enough to extract meaning from the scraps of text that found their way into her hands. Her library expanded beyond the damaged reader, which by now she had completely memorized and burned page by page, feeding it to the fire one section at a time after committing each to memory. A piece of newspaper used to wrap purchases from the general store in town, she would smooth it out, read it quickly in whatever private moment she could find, then use it for its intended purpose before anyone noticed her attention to it. A page torn from a Bible, found in the trash after the plantation owner's wife had accidentally spilled ink across several pages and discarded them. She read the Psalms and Proverbs, the Gospels, and epistles, choosing which verses to remember and which to forget. A shipping manifest, discarded after goods were delivered from Savannah. She learned the names of cities and the prices of commodities, understanding in a new way how slavery functioned as an economic system, how her labor translated into profits that flowed to distant places. Labels on bottles and crates, which she read while working in the storeroom. Each piece was studied, memorized, and often destroyed to eliminate evidence. Her education was ephemeral, existing fully only in her memory, the only archive that could not be confiscated, the only library that could not be burned. She read Bible verses others were not allowed to hear, verses that complicated the simple, subservient theology offered in the quarters by visiting white preachers who came monthly to deliver carefully selected messages. The white preachers emphasized submission. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ. They preached that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, that rebellion was sin, that the social order was divinely ordained. But reading the Bible herself, selecting her own passages, she found other verses that told a different story. Let my people go, that they may serve me. God commanding the liberation of enslaved people, demanding their freedom not as a reward, but as a right. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus, a vision of equality that contradicted everything. about the world she inhabited. She understood, with sudden clarity, why enslavers controlled which verses were read, and how they were interpreted. Why Bibles were kept locked away from enslaved people. Why literacy was forbidden. The Bible, like any text, could be a tool of liberation or oppression, depending on who held it and what they chose to emphasize. This was a sophisticated insight about power and interpretation, about how knowledge is curated and controlled, about how those in authority shape truth by determining which truths are spoken and which are silenced. She read newspapers wrapped around goods delivered to the plantation, learning about places she had never seen, events occurring beyond the narrow boundaries of her world, possibilities that existed outside the plantation's borders. Cities with names like Boston and Philadelphia and New York, where buildings rose 6 stories high, where free, black people walked the streets and owned businesses and published their own newspapers. She learned of abolitionist concepts that existed in the North, movements of people dedicated to ending slavery through legal and political means. She learned of political debates about the expansion of slavery into Western territories, arguments that revealed slavery was contested, not universally accepted, that white people themselves disagreed about its morality and sustainability. She encountered news of slave rebellions, the Amistad case where enslaved Africans had seized a ship and sailed it to freedom, the Creole Mutiny where enslaved people had taken control of a vessel bound for New Orleans and forced it to British territory where slavery was illegal, stories that proved resistance was possible, that some people had won there, freedom through courage and action. She learned that laws were written by men, meaning laws could be unmade by men, rewritten by different men with different values, that nothing about her condition was permanent or inevitable or written in stone. What one generation created, another generation could destroy. This knowledge changed her subtly but profoundly. Not all at once, not in any single revelation, but gradually, the way water reshapes stone through patient persistence. Her understanding of herself shifted. She was not naturally inferior. She was systematically oppressed. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant the problem was not in her, but in the world, not in her nature, but in the laws and customs that constrained her. She began sharing information carefully, quietly, selectively, becoming a subtle conduit between the world of written knowledge and the oral culture of the quarters. Never in groups. Groups attracted attention, raised suspicions, left too many witnesses who might let something slip or who might deliberately inform in exchange for favor. Never in ways that could be traced back to her reading. The information had to seem like rumor, like something overheard from white people's conversations, like common knowledge rather than forbidden literacy. A verse whispered to her mother while they worked side by side in the kitchen garden. "Mama, I heard someone say once that God remembers his people in bondage, that he hears their cries and will deliver them." A fragment of news shared with Samuel. They say there's places up north where slavery's illegal, where a person who escapes can't be sent back. A story told to the children at night when she was minding them. Once there were people on a ship sailing across the ocean, and they were supposed to be slaves, but they decided they didn't want to be slaves anymore. So they took over the ship and sailed it to a place where they could be free. Always deniable, always vague enough to seem like oral tradition rather than printed text. She became a translator, a bridge, moving information from the written word to the spoken word, from the world of white literacy to the world of black oral culture. Careful never to reveal the mechanism of translation. But literacy did not free her body. This was the cruel paradox of her situation. The overseer still came at dawn. The work was still brutal, picking cotton until her fingers bled, carrying water until her back screamed, cooking over fires that left her covered in burns, washing clothes and lie until her hands cracked and bled. The violence was still arbitrary and constant. The hunger was still real. The exhaustion was still crushing. The Degradation was still daily. Literacy changed none of this. Reading did not make the whip hurt less. Knowledge did not make the work lighter. Understanding the injustice did not end the injustice, but it freed her mind in ways that mattered even when her body remained in chains. And a free mind in an enslaved body is a dangerous thing. Dangerous to those who profit from ignorance. Dangerous to a system that requires its victims to believe in their own inferiority. She could imagine alternatives now. Could conceive of a world where she was not property, where her labor belonged to herself, where her children, if she ever had children, would not be sold away from her. Imagination did not change reality, but it made reality unbearable in a new way, not as the natural order she had been taught to accept since birth, but as an injustice to be resisted, an evil to be fought, a temporary condition rather than a permanent state. The discovery came suddenly, the way disasters always do, not gradually, not with warning, but in a single moment when careful planning collapsed into chaos. It was winter, 1845.3 years into her secret education. She had grown confident, perhaps too confident, in her ability to study undetected. 3 years without being caught had made the danger seem less immediate, had allowed her to take risks she would not have taken in the beginning that a candle burned too low one night while she was absorbed in reading. She was studying a newspaper fragment, an article about a slave rebellion that had been suppressed in Louisiana, about 30 enslaved people who had tried to fight their way to freedom and failed, and became so absorbed in the details that she did not notice the candle had burned down to a stub, the flame growing larger and more visible as it consumed the last of the wax. Smoke lingered too long in the still, cold air of the quarters. Thicker than the usual haze from the central fire, darker, more acrid, carrying the distinct smell of burned wax rather than wood. An overseer named Pike, a cruel man who had been hired 2 years earlier, who seemed to take pleasure in finding excuses for punishment, entered the quarters unexpectedly, without the usual warning of footsteps or the dog's bark. The book, a different book now. A Bible she had found discarded after water damage, its pages wrinkled but readable, was hidden with practiced speed. She had learned to move quickly over 3 years of practice, her hands knowing exactly where to go, what to do, how to eliminate evidence in seconds. She buried the Bible beneath her body, pressing it against the floor, her ragged dress covering it completely. The candle she pinched out with her fingers, accepting the burn as the price of silence, the sharp pain barely registering against the overwhelming fear. The newspaper fragment she crumpled and shoved into her mouth, swallowing dry paper that scraped her throat and sat like a stone in her stomach, making her want to gag but forcing it down anyway because evidence consumed was evidence destroyed to be why the time Pike reached her palate. She was lying down, eyes closed, breathing deeply and evenly as though she had been asleep for hours. But the smoke still hung in the air, visible in the dim light from the central fire. The smell of burned wax still clung to her corner of the room, distinctive and incriminating. And Pike was not stupid, whatever else he was. "What you burning in here, gal?" She opened her eyes slowly, feigning confusion, feigning the disorientation of someone wrongly wakened from deep sleep. "Sir." Her voice thick, muzzy, perfectly calibrated. "Don't play dumb with me." His voice came hard and suspicious. "I smell smoke. Strong. Smoke. Candle smoke. What you been burning?" "Nothing, sir. I've been asleep." Her voice steady despite the terror flooding through her veins, despite her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could see it. He searched her pallet roughly, throwing aside her thin blanket, scattering her few possessions, the button, the ribbon, the stone, all her treasures tumbling across the floor. His fingers found the loose floorboard. Her heart stopped. This was it. The end point. 3 years of careful study about to be destroyed in a single moment of discovery. But he did not pull it up, did not think to check beneath it. Perhaps it did not occur to him that a slave would hide anything of value in such an elaborate way. He straightened, frustrated. "You show me your hands," he ordered. She held them out, palms up, fingers spread. He examined them closely for ink stains. There were none. She had learned early to wash carefully after reading anything, to never let evidence linger. On her skin. "If I find out you've been stealing candles from Big House," he said, his voice low and threatening, his face close to hers, his breath hot and sour, "I'll take it out of your hide. 20 lashes for stealing. Maybe more. You want that?" "No, sir." Her voice small, submissive, exactly what he wanted to hear. He left, but the threat lingered long after his footsteps faded. After that night, they watched her with increased attention. Pike would appear, unexpectedly, at the quarters, walking through at odd hours, early morning, late evening, the middle of the night. The plantation owner's wife began asking the other enslaved women questions during their work. Had they noticed anything strange about the girl? Had they seen her with books or papers? They reported nothing, either because they had seen nothing or because they understood that protecting her was protecting themselves, that solidarity was survival even when it meant refusing to cooperate with power. She stopped reading for 2 weeks. Let the book remain hidden beneath the floorboard, untouched. Let her hands forget the feel of pages, her eyes forget the shape of letters. That IT was agony, like losing a friend, like going blind after years of sight. But it was necessary. The only way to survive was to let the suspicion fade, to prove, through her behavior, that she was what they thought she was, an ordinary slave girl with no hidden depths, no dangerous knowledge, no secret life. Then they tested her, deliberately and obviously. Catherine left a page of her copybook near where the girl was working in the parlor, positioned on a low table at exactly the girl's eye level, the writing clearly visible, fresh ink still slightly wet, impossible to miss. Catherine watched from the doorway, pretending to read a novel, but actually observing, waiting to see how the girl would react. She recognized the trap immediately, so she looked at the page with the blank incomprehension expected of her, her eyes passing over the words without recognition, without interest, without the subtle movement that would indicate she was parsing letters into meaning. She even picked it up to move it, held it carelessly, upside down, as though it were merely paper and not language, merely an obstacle to her dusting and not a text to be read. "You can set that on the desk," Catherine said, disappointed. "Yes, miss." She moved it without looking at it again, her performance flawless. Catherine returned to her novel, convinced. The test had failed to reveal what they suspected. From that day forward, she changed her methods entirely. She memorized everything and destroyed what she read, maintaining no physical evidence whatsoever. The Bible, her current teacher, her treasured possession, she burned page by page, committing each to memory before feeding it to the fire in tiny portions that would not be noticed, mixing it with other trash so the destruction would not be obvious. It broke her heart to do it. Each page burned felt like destroying a friend. But a burned book could not betray her, and the knowledge in the book now lived in her head, transferred from page to memory, from physical object to mental archive. She became a living library, a walking archive, a human repository of knowledge that existed nowhere else. Words lived only in her head, the safest archive she possessed, the archive that could not be searched, could not be confiscated, could not be destroyed except by death itself. She continued learning, but differently now, more cautiously. She read when opportunity presented itself, a glimpse of a newspaper on a table in the main house, visible for only seconds while she worked. A moment alone with a discarded letter, time enough to scan it before using it to start a fire. A sign on a building when she accompanied the mistress to town, read in a glance, and remembered forever. Each reading was brief, furtive, immediately committed to memory, that her education became entirely internal, invisible, impossible to detect unless she chose to reveal it, and in some ways more powerful for its hiddenness. Because now no one could take it from her. The book could be burned, but the words in her mind were permanent. The evidence could be destroyed, but the knowledge persisted. The physical object could be confiscated, but the memory remained untouched, inviolate. Hers alone did no document records her ultimate fate. No census names her. No plantation ledger tracks. Her beyond perhaps a single line in a property inventory. Negro woman, age 16, house servant, value $600. No diary mentions her in passing. No letter describes her. No photograph captures her face. No gravestone marks where she is buried. No descendant knows her name. She exists in history only as an absence, a silence, a person-shaped hole in the archive, where her story should be, but is not. And yet the world knows she existed, or rather, thousands like her existed. The system that sought to prevent her left extensive records, laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people, court cases prosecuting those who taught them, plantation rules forbidding literacy, advertisements for runaways that noted can read and write as identifying characteristics, all of them proving that people like her existed, that they learned despite the prohibition, that they studied in secret, that they risked everything for knowledge. Some who survived to freedom told their stories. Frederick Douglass described learning to read by tricking white children into teaching him, by trading bread for lessons. Harriet Jacobs wrote about teaching herself to write while hiding in an attic for 7 years. William Wells Brown mentioned learning the alphabet from his master's children. Countless others mentioned in passing that they had learned to read before emancipation, though they rarely detailed how, perhaps because revealing methods might endanger others still in bondage. The girl in Georgia was one thread in a vast, hidden network of learners, people who understood that literacy was survival, that knowledge was resistance, that freedom began in the mind before it ever touched the body. As you listen, ask yourself, what would you risk to read a single word? Hold that thought with you. She may have been sold south after the close call with Pike, after suspicion made her dangerous to keep, after her owner decided the risk of harboring a potentially literate slave outweighed her value as a worker. Plantation owners often sold enslaved people who seemed troublesome, who showed too much intelligence, who possessed knowledge or skills that made them dangerous. The Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, had an insatiable appetite for labor. Cotton plantations expanded constantly, requiring fresh workers to replace those who died from disease or exhaustion or violence. The interstate slave trade moved hundreds of thousands of people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1820 and 1860. Tearing apart families, communities, and lives. If sold south, she would have been transported with others, possibly chained together in a coffle, a line of enslaved people linked by neck irons or handcuffs, forced to walk hundreds of miles to the slave markets of New Orleans or Natchez or Montgomery. There, she would have stood on an auction block while men examined her teeth to check her age, felt her muscles to assess her strength, inspected her body to evaluate her capacity for labor and reproduction. She would have been sold to the highest bidder, but she would have carried her literacy with her, hidden in her mind, accessible when opportunity allowed. A secret that traveled with her across state lines and into new bondage. She may have escaped after 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act made the North more dangerous, but the Underground Railroad more organized. If she escaped, she would have had advantages that her illiterate counterparts might not have possessed. She could read signs and maps, could navigate using written directions instead of relying solely on oral traditions and the North Star. She could forge a pass if she obtained paper and ink, could write out documentation claiming she was a free woman traveling with her master's permission. She could read newspaper advertisements warning of slave catchers in the area. She may have lived long enough to hear freedom announced in 1865, to experience that moment when the legal basis of slavery collapsed, when the Confederacy fell and the Union Army arrived with news of emancipation. To stand on the same plantation where she had first stolen a book from the trash heap, listening to Union soldiers read the Emancipation Proclamation aloud, hearing words she could now read for herself. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. If she survived to that moment, she would have been 36 years old enough to remember her entire life in bondage, young enough to potentially build something new in freedom, though 36 years of slavery had left their mark on every person who survived it. in bodies broken by work, in minds scarred by trauma, in spirits tested by suffering. To understand her courage, one must understand what she was defying: the full weight of the legal system, the customs of her society, the violence that enforced both. The laws prohibiting slave literacy proliferated across the South in the 1830s and 1840s. A direct response to Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831, Turner, an enslaved preacher who had learned to read and had studied the Bible intensively, interpreted its passages as calls to violent resistance against slavery. He saw visions, believed himself chosen by God to lead his people to freedom, organized a rebellion that killed approximately 60 white people before being suppressed by militia and federal troops. The rebellion terrified white Southerners in ways that previous resistance had not. This was not individual flight or isolated violence. This was organized, religiously motivated, literate resistance. Turner could read. He could interpret texts. He could communicate ideas. He could lead. And if one literate slave could do this, what might thousands of literate slaves accomplish? The response was swift and brutal. Militias killed as many as 200 black people in retaliation, many of them uninvolved in the rebellion, killed simply for being black in a moment of white panic. But the violence extended beyond immediate revenge into legal reformation. If literacy could lead to rebellion, white Southerners reasoned, then literacy must be prevented at all costs. Georgia's law, passed in 1829, made it illegal to teach any enslaved person to read or write. The penalty for white people who violated this law was a fine of up to $500 and possible imprisonment. For free black people who taught slaves, the penalty could include whipping, up to 39 lashes, and indefinite imprisonment. Similar laws existed throughout the slaveholding South. South Carolina made it illegal to teach slaves to read as early as 1740. Virginia passed its comprehensive prohibition in 1831 directly after Nat Turner's rebellion. North Carolina's law, passed in 1830 to 1831, forbade teaching slaves to read or write and made it illegal to distribute abolitionist literature to enslaved people. The laws acknowledge implicitly a truth that white Southerners could not quite admit, that enslaved people were fully capable of learning, that their illiteracy was enforced rather than natural, that intelligence knew no racial boundaries. If enslaved people truly were intellectually inferior, as racial ideology claimed, why would laws be necessary to prevent them from learning? If they could not learn, prohibition would be redundant. The very existence of these laws undermined the racist justifications for slavery, even as they sought to maintain it. Slavery required more than physical coercion to function. It required ideological justification, a story white Southerners told themselves about why slavery was acceptable, why it was the natural order, why black people were suited for bondage. This ideology rested on claims of racial inferiority, that black people were intellectually incapable of self-governance, that they were suited by nature for manual labor under white supervision, that they were happier and better off as slaves than they would be as free people. Literacy undermined all of these justifications simply by existing. An enslaved person who could read Shakespeare demonstrated sophistication. One who could solve mathematical problems demonstrated intelligence. One who could engage with philosophical texts demonstrated abstract reasoning. One who could write eloquently demonstrated capabilities that supposedly did not exist. Their very existence as literate people proved, undeniably, that the racial hierarchy was fiction rather than fact, that the supposed inferiority was imposed rather than inherent. More practically, literacy gave enslaved people specific tools for resistance. They could forge passes to travel without their owner's permission. They could read abolitionist newspapers and pamphlets, publications like The Liberator and The North Star, learning about the movement to end slavery. They could communicate with free black people and white abolitionists through letters, coordinating assistance and sharing information. They could document the abuses they suffered, creating records that contradicted the benevolent mythology enslavers promoted. Frederick Douglass understood this with perfect clarity. His autobiography describes the moment his owner discovered that the owner's wife had been teaching Douglass to read. The owner forbade further lessons, warning that learning would forever unfit him to be a slave. Douglass wrote in response, "These words sank deep into my heart. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom." The girl in Georgia came to the same understanding independently through her own dangerous education. She grasped that literacy was power, that knowledge disrupted the control system, that reading was itself an act of resistance. She never wrote a book, never saw her words in print, never held a published volume with her name on the cover. She never gave a speech at an abolitionist gathering, never stood on a platform addressing crowds of sympathetic listeners. Her name was never printed in the Liberator or the North Star. She never testified before Congress about the horrors of slavery, never had her experiences entered into the official record of national discussion, but she read a book when she was not supposed to. And that single act, repeated across thousands of nights, challenged an entire system built, ants. Because enslavers feared literacy for one very specific, very practical reason: a person who can read can imagine a different future. And imagination is where freedom begins. This is why they wrote laws against it, why they whipped people for it, why they sold families apart over it, why they murdered teachers for teaching it, why they burned schools and destroyed books, and created an entire legal architecture designed to prevent it. Not because reading was inherently dangerous. Words on a page could not break chains or not overthrow governments by themselves, but because reading enabled people to imagine alternatives, to conceive of worlds different from the one they inhabited, to understand that their condition was not natural or inevitable or divinely ordained, that a gun could be confiscated, a knife could be taken away, a rebellious slave could be killed, and the rebellion would die with them. But an educated mind could not be unchained, could not be unlearned, could not be controlled through violence alone. Once you knew that words on a page carried meaning, once you understood that people in distant places were arguing for your freedom, once you had read that all men are created equal, you could never unknow these things. The knowledge persisted even when the physical book was destroyed, even when the evidence was eliminated, even when the danger forced you to hide what you knew. Though her specific testimony does not survive, others illuminate what her experience might have been like, showing the patterns that repeated across the South, the common threads that connected individual stories into a larger tapestry of resistance. Frederick Douglass wrote in his 1845 narrative, "I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity." But then he continued, "The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers." Susie King Taylor, who learned to read as a child in Georgia in the 1850s, almost exactly the same time and place as the girl in this story, wrote in her memoir, "I had about 40 pupils, some of them adults. We had to be very cautious. The knowledge of our learning would have meant whipping for us all, and we not only kept our learning secret, but were ingenious in devising means to safeguard our cherished knowledge." These testimonies share common themes that likely applied to the girl in Georgia as well. Learning happened in secret, almost never through formal instruction. The knowledge brought both pain and power. The risk was enormous, but the reward was worth it because literacy could not be taken away once acquired. Once learned, it became a possession more valuable than any physical object, a form of wealth that existed in the mind where it could not be confiscated or sold. When the Civil War ended and emancipation became law, when Union troops arrived in Georgia reading proclamations and announcing freedom, formerly enslaved people demonstrated an extraordinary, almost overwhelming hunger for education. This hunger manifested immediately and universally. They built schools with their own labor and meager resources. They traveled miles to attend classes, walking hours each way, prioritizing education above immediate economic needs even when their families desperately needed their labor. They hired teachers and paid them with money they could barely spare. They prioritized education above almost everything else, understanding that literacy was the key to genuine freedom, to economic opportunity, to political participation, to full citizenship. Booker T. Washington, born enslaved in Virginia and freed as a child, wrote in his autobiography, "It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn, as fast as any kind of teachers could be secured. Not only were day schools filled, but night schools as well. The great ambition of the older people was to try to learn to read the Bible before they died." This explosion of educational enthusiasm in the years immediately following emancipation suggests how much had been suppressed during slavery. How many people like the girl in Georgia had wanted to learn, but had been prevented by law and violence and systematic denial. Historians have documented that literacy rates among formerly enslaved people immediately after emancipation were far higher than should have been possible given the legal prohibitions and the systematic denial of education. The only explanation is that significant numbers of enslaved people had engaged in secret learning during bondage, learning that left no official record, that existed beneath the surface of documented history, that survived only in the memories of those who experienced it. By 1870, approximately 20% of formerly enslaved Black Americans could read. By 1880, 30%. By 1900, more than half were literate. This represents one of the most dramatic educational transformations in human history. Millions of people acquiring literacy within a generation or two, overcoming centuries of systematic denial, building on foundations laid in secret during the years of bondage. But her struggle did not end with emancipation. The battle for education continued in different forms through different mechanisms, with different enemies employing similar tactics. After the Civil War, white Southerners resisted Black education through violence against schools and teachers. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations specifically targeted Black schools and educators, burning buildings, threatening teachers, attacking students. Through economic pressure, through legal restrictions that created separate and profoundly unequal school systems, channeling public funds primarily to white schools while starving Black schools of resources. It would take another century, until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, until federal enforcement of integration for Black Americans, to gain anything approaching equal educational access in the South. Even today, the fight continues in different forms. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods remain chronically underfunded. Educational inequities persist along racial lines in access to advanced courses, experienced teachers, adequate facilities, and modern technology. The achievement gap reflects not racial differences in ability, but racial differences in opportunity, investment, and support. In this sense, her struggle, the struggle of a 13-year-old girl hiding a book beneath a floorboard in 1842, continues in the present, still incomplete, still requiring vigilance and resistance, and the persistent demand for educational justice. Every law banning education, every whipping for possessing a Bible, every burned school and murdered teacher, every obstacle placed in the path of learning, they all testified to one undeniable truth. Those in power knew that literacy was insurrection, not might be insurrection, not could potentially become insurrection under the right circumstances, was insurrection, inherently, inevitably, because literacy enabled people to imagine alternatives and imagination was the most dangerous threat to any system built on the premise that the current order was natural and inevitable and could not be changed. That is why they tried to keep it from her, through laws and violence and systematic denial, through creating an entire social system designed to prevent enslaved people from learning. And that is why she fought for it anyway, not with guns or violence, not through dramatic rebellion or spectacular resistance, but with patience and courage and unwillingness to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her mind. Not loudly, not proudly, but alone, by candlelight, knowing that every single word she deciphered could cost her her life. She won that fight, even if the world does not know her name, even if history does not record her fate, even if she died in bondage without ever experiencing legal freedom. She won it every time she deciphered a new word, every time a sentence revealed its meaning, every time she committed a passage to memory where it could not be confiscated. She won it every time she shared knowledge with others, quietly spreading literacy despite the prohibition. She won it by surviving as long as she did with her mind intact and her hope alive, refusing to let bondage colonize her interior life even when it controlled her body. And she continues to win it every time someone tells her story, every time a reader encounters these words and understands what she risked, what she achieved, what she represented. Every time her resistance is remembered and honored and continued. Stories like hers were never meant to survive. They were deliberately erased, names omitted from records, lives reduced to inventory numbers, resistance scrubbed from official histories, achievements dismissed as impossible or unimportant or irrelevant to the grand narrative of American progress. The erasure was purposeful and systematic. If enslaved people could be depicted as content, as incapable of learning, as less than fully human, then slavery could be justified. Then the ideology of white supremacy could be maintained. But stories like hers destroy that comfortable mythology. They prove that enslaved people were fully human, intelligent, capable, resistant, determined, possessed of interior lives, as rich and complex as any free person's. They prove that what was stolen from them was not innate capacity, but opportunity, not ability, but access, not potential, but permission. They prove that education is not a privilege to be granted by those in power, but a right to be claimed even in the face of deadly opposition. She lit a candle in the darkness 200 years ago, knowing it might cost her everything. That light still burns. It burns in every person who reads the story, who understands what she risked and why it mattered, who carries her memory forward into a future she helped create even if she never lived to see it. A future where a girl can learn to read without fear, where books are freely available, not hidden beneath floorboards, where education is a right, not a crime. She did not live to see that future fully realized, and we have not yet either, because educational justice remains incomplete, because the fight continues in new forms. But she believed in it enough to risk everything. And that belief, that courage, that subtle but unbreakable refusal to accept ignorance as her destiny, that is her legacy. That is what survives when everything else has been erased. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, speak it, remember it. Because silence is how stories like hers disappear. That is why her story, though unknown in its particulars, must be told and retold and never forgotten. Because she represents every person who ever fought for the right to know, the right to learn, the right to read words on a page and understand that the world could be different than it is. Every person who ever lit a candle in the darkness and dared to imagine freedom.